terrorism and other stories. Armageddon is a place in Israel. I love that opening line. I'm sorry, I know I'm not going to do this all throughout. But Armageddon in the Bible is the end of the world. And so she's saying Armageddon is a place in Israel. It's quite a provocative statement. The end of the world is a place in Israel. I drove there on a golden morning in apricot season. In Hebrew, the name for Armageddon is Megiddo. And Megiddo is an ancient crossroads watered by centuries of blood. So here we have that metaphor for watering as if it's growing something, but instead it's talking about blood. So, sorry. Let me get my pen. So, metaphor. I'm going to be careful to try and write a bit more clearly. The warriors and zealots who prowl the Holy Land have paused for centuries there to decide which direction to take. The roads stretch west to Tel Aviv and the Mediterranean Sea, east to the Galilee, north towards Lebanon, or south towards what is now known as the West Bank. At Megiddo Junction stand a military prison, an old kibbutz, and a bus stop. So we have that contrast of imagery there of a prison, a kibbutz, and a bus stop. So imagery. And it's a contrasting imagery to sort of show you how the ordinary stands side by side with the violent. The number 830 commuter bus was hit on the dawn run from Tel Aviv to Tiberias, crowded with dozing, daydreaming soldiers, men and women in their late teens and early 20s on their way to military bases that pepper the mostly Arab-populated Israeli farmlands. So I should mention that in Israel there is compulsory military service that all 18-year-olds have to do, and so that's why they are in their late teens, early 20s, because they have a certain period of time where if you are Jewish and you're Israeli, you must do military service for a year. And so most of the people who are manning those checkpoints are young men and women. And so they were going through to that area, that Arab-populated Israeli farmlands, that area that is in the West Bank, that they are encroaching on. So that it's meant to be an area where there's Arabic people. So this section here, they were traveling there into that area, and they were bombed. A 17-year-old boy from Jenin had stolen a car and packed it full of homemade explosives, pulled up alongside the bus's gas tank and blown himself up. The boy, Hazma Samudi, had been sent by Islamic Jihad. The Palestinian prisoners in their cells heard the explosion and cheered. So even at this point, she is humanizing the suicide bomber by giving him his name. On that June morning, clean breezes and honeyed light fell on the watermelon fields of Armageddon. So see how she's contrasting the imagery there? She's got clean breezes, honeyed light, and up here she was talking about the golden morning. So she's contrasting the beauty of the place with the violence that is happening there. So sunlight sprayed the yellow grasses and fresh pine trees shaded the road. Pieces of people had gotten blasted onto the roadside. So see there, we have that juxtaposed imagery, that contrast between the beauty and the violence. Sheets of bus siding lay tangled in barbed wire at the prison's edge. Men in long beards and rubber gloves, Orthodox Jews, volunteered, combed quietly through the grassy slopes, hunting for pieces of human flesh, gathering every last bit of dead body for a proper burial. So if you are not aware, just like in the Christian religion, there are different Jewish groups, and the Orthodox Jews are the really conservative ones. They're the ones that you might see with the big black hats and the curly bits coming down the side of their ears, and the beards, they're the Orthodox Jews. There's actually a show called Unorthodox on Netflix if you wanted to look into that a little bit more, but they're the conservative Jewish group within the area. Later that day, I found the bus driver in a hospital cot, and he talked about the soldiers in their smart car keys. He knew their faces and their schedules, where they climbed aboard and where they hopped down. They reminded him of his sons, of his own younger days fighting in the 1967 Middle East War. They were wonderful, he said. That was the first suicide bombing I covered, and it sticks there in my memory, the brightness and the death of it. A morning in June, a morning in apricot season. So we have that repetition to try and show us that it was just like an ordinary day. Night had dragged itself out of morning's way, but no freshness broke through a swelter that warped the windows and stuck to the skin, even at dawn. Israeli news wires are trails of gasoline, the bombs are matches. News races, burns and gallops. 17 people died at Megiddo, most of them burned alive. So here we have, again, the metaphor. News wires are trails of gasoline, bombs are matches. So it's igniting the anger within the community. The news travels quickly, it races, burns and gallops, so it's personifying to a degree the news of what has happened. 17 people died at Megiddo, 18 if you count the teenaged bomber, and I think we should. Okay, here we go again. She's humanizing the teenage bomber. They, in the news, count 17 dead, but there are actually 18 if you count the person who blew himself up, and she thinks that that person should be counted. So she's humanizing. Islamic Jihad bragged that it had carried out the bombing on the Zionist bus. The group's leader, Sheikh Abdullah Shami, said the attack marked the 35th anniversary of the Middle East War, when Israel seized the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem, wresting the land from Arabs. We say to the enemy, we will continue to destroy the protective shield Sharon talks about, the Sheikh said. They will never enjoy security as long as occupation exists in our land. And so that builds on that sense of fear within these Jewish people. Remember that these Jewish people who have come to Israel have created this country out of a sense of fear. A fear that what happened to them in World War II could happen to them again if they don't ensure they have a place of safety. And they are making that place of safety in Israel. The only way they can ensure they are safe is to get rid of anyone who is not Jewish. It's the only way they can ensure that they will be safe. In that spring of 2002, the second Palestinian Intifada was nearing 2 years old. Suicide bombers came by day, and at night Israeli tanks seized Palestinian turf in the West Bank. So we can see the disproportionate power of the two groups. We have 17-year-olds who are single by themselves, blowing themselves up to try and have an impact in this war, compared to the Israeli tanks that are sort of ploughing their way through buildings and residents to control the turf. Things had gotten out of control. Violence fed violence. Violence fed violence. Blood washed blood. Oh, I love it. So remember that repetition. That tit for tat. So if you do this, then I'll do this, and because I did this, you will do it. It's back and forth without an end. The Israelis launched Operation Defensive Shield, which later morphed into Operation Determined Path. Behind the names, it meant that Israel was reoccupying the West Bank. It meant that the Oslo Accords, the exhaustively argued framework for peace and a Palestinian state, were lost. So the Jewish nation of Israel deliberately ignored this framework for peace. It was late afternoon when I drove back into Jerusalem from Megiddo. By then, everybody had seen the pictures, the burned bus and the dead soldiers. Israeli tanks had already groaned into Jenin, the bombers' hometown. So in response to this boy blowing up the bus, Israeli tanks had gone into the bomber's hometown. This is what happens. I sat in the car waiting for a light to change at the edge of East Jerusalem. The heat hummed and buzzed. Hasidic boys in their brimmed hats tripped along towards the walls of the old city, carrying bottles of soda pop, sweating into long-sleeved Oxfords. So that's a description of those Eastern European Orthodox Jews. They wear those white shirts, white collared shirts all the way up, and big black jackets, black hats, or the round caps on their heads. So she's describing them having sips of soda pop, so soft drink, and tripping along the old city. An older Palestinian man crossed their path. So this is a non-Jewish man. An older Palestinian man crossed their path, and they surrounded him, jeering and taunting. They crunched their features in disgust and threw their shoulders back, unscrewed a bottle of Sprite and splashed the older man's face and shirt. "These are our streets and our city," their stances said. They were poking the Arab and spitting on him. A taxi squealed to the curb. The Arab driver pushed up his sleeves as he ran, shoes slapping clumsily over the pavement. Another Arab man leapt out of another car. They pulled the old worker away with pats on the back, threw glower and threats over their shoulders. The Orthodox boys shuffled off. Jerusalem rearranged itself. The light changed and I drove away. It was over, except it was never over. So here, even the city itself has been personified. It's rearranging itself. And from being in Jerusalem and seeing what happens, there is this air of arrogance that the Jewish people, in particular the Orthodox Jews, show as they walk around. They are still not the majority within Jerusalem. There's still about 50% of the population, I think, or possibly a little bit more, is still Arabic in the city of Jerusalem itself. But even then, there are soldiers, Jewish soldiers patrolling the area, Jewish teenagers acting like they own the place and being extremely rude, even to tourists, I must say, in comparison to the Arabs and the Christians who lived there. So after midnight, tanks and bulldozers arrived at Palestinian Authority President Yasser Arafat's Ramallah headquarters. Can I please apologize for my pronunciation? The Palestinian government center, just over the line from Jerusalem. By first light, the compound had been demolished, and Arafat, the crooked president of a country that still doesn't exist, waddled through the remaining rooms. So in retaliation for one kid blowing himself up, they bulldozed the Palestinian president's home, his government headquarters. They bulldozed the whole place. Yeah? And even though Yasser Arafat was possibly crooked in terms of accepting bribes, etc., he was still officially and democratically elected by the Palestinians, and so they just had no regard for the peace process. The walls were blasted off the soldiers' sleeping quarters. The floors toppled like a fallen layer cake, clothes and wires dripping from the squashed rooms. So we have the simile there. A skinny soldier shimmied like a child on a jungle gym. sweating and grunting in sock feet to rummage in the wreckage. Finally, he tugged his shoes free of the rubble and held them aloft like trophies. So this soldier had to run in the middle of the night without any shoes on, and he's gone back through the wreckage and found his shoes. Something as simple as that image there shows you the shock of the attack that the Israelis had gone about. His comrades cheered from the ground. The summer light came thick and naked, laying it all bare, and Palestinian families walked aghast through the wreckage, silent and stunned. Entire clans come together as if on picnic to inspect the broken structure of their national dreams. 24 hours in Jerusalem, spread like a roadmap to misery. So she'd been in Jerusalem for 24 hours, so one day, and within that one day, there had been a suicide bomber, and Israel had completely demolished the Palestinian government center, the headquarters, in retaliation. I knew a Palestinian woman who lived in Jerusalem. She was pretty and slim from living on cigarettes and Nescafe, but her eyes were old and sad. Sometimes she drank ice vodka until she was drunk, leaning over with curses falling out of her mouth, stabbing the night with a cigarette, roaring in broken laughter. Can I just point out how significant that is? As a Palestinian, if she is Muslim, which I think we're meant to believe that she is, because she's Palestinian, they don't usually drink alcohol. And the fact that she is drinking alcohol shows you the depth of her despair. She was still a teenager when Israel soldiers arrested her for membership in an underground Palestinian political movement. That was back in the bad old days of the first Intifada. Break their bones. That's what Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin told the Israeli soldiers, or so the story goes. So we have that reference to story. She's listening to the other side, and they're giving their story here. Some Israelis insist this with a command to be soft with the Palestinians. Break their bones, but don't kill them. Beat them, but don't shoot them. As if that is soft, as if that statement there is okay. It's okay to break their bones and to beat them up, but don't kill them, because that makes us look bad. But an American reporter who covered the Intifada told me he saw Israeli soldiers systematically break the arms of little boys, one by one, working their way through a village so they couldn't throw rocks. Israeli is merciful. Israeli is brutal. So again, we have that contrast. The two deathless storylines of the Jewish state crowding the streets and minds of Jerusalem. Most people believe one or the other and believe it fervently. So you either support Israel or you are against it. There are very few people who are unbiased in this conflict, who say, I can see that both sides are wrong. Yeah, so especially those who live in Jerusalem. It is hard to find anybody who acknowledges that both might be true, and then some, that believing that both Israel can be merciful and brutal. The Palestinian woman told me her own story one night. We were both drinking and I didn't take notes, but I never forgot it. When they arrested her and brought her to jail, she made the soldiers angry because she yelled at them, "Fucking Jews, wish I were Hitler." She was embarrassed about yelling those things. I was so crazy, she said. I was just crazy. So, having just read Night and seen what and read about what that experience was like and what Hitler's policies did to those people, you can understand the fire behind those words that she was yelling and why she is embarrassed that she yelled such a thing. And she sort of apologizes for her actions by saying, I was crazy. I was just crazy. I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have said that otherwise. She told me that she was tortured for days, beaten, abused, threatened with rape. One day, a particularly brutal Israeli interrogator wounded her breast with a nail, left it bleeding. She pulled her blouse aside and showed me the scar, deep and permanent. Then she told me about the young Israeli guard. This stranger, this anonymous Israeli man, sat with her hour after dark hour, fanning her raw wound with a magazine, and all the while he cried. And so again here we see the brutal man and the man who cried, and both of them are Israeli. So both of them, we have the brutal and the merciful. And you can't say that the entirety of that nation is one or the other, because they are both. I saw her scar. I listened to her words. I don't know if the story is true. Again, she keeps that skepticism in order to try and be neutral. In that I don't know if it actually occurred. It may have been apocryphal. And I'll put a definition for that here. These are my memories of her memories. And so memory has its own flaws, so it's not the best source or the truest source of information to rely on memory. And this is Jerusalem, world capital of dubious stories, centuries of stories half forgotten and passed on, stories of saints and prophets and torturers, everybody fighting for the best story. The one that gives you a religion, a claim, a right. So that repetition of story is important, because she's saying that these things that occur have been turned into a mythology, turned into proof that I am right, that my religion is the true one, because I have this story to back it up. But I never doubted the emotional truth behind this one story, and I've kept it because it encapsulated the things I could sense but not say. That after their awful history, locked in a death march for survival, Israelis and Palestinians had become what they never wished to be, one people after all, each one half of a whole, locked together in union. You could not touch or understand from the outside, torturing one another, tarnishing their own souls with each other's blood, speaking hidden words in voices pitched so only the other could listen, maybe even loving one another in some secret sublimated way, each capable of cruelty that is deeper because it understands exactly what it does, because it's not blind. It is a story not only about pain inflicted, a strong torturer, and a helpless victim. It is that story, yes, but it's also the story of a weeping teenager confronting the underbelly of his own country, fighting his conscience with nothing but a magazine to flap in the dark. It's about the pain that turns back to gnaw on the tormentor, about the damage we do to others because we want to protect ourselves, and how that damage echoes back into our own souls. So this idea that in trying to be safe, we justify things that damage ourselves. So in trying to protect ourselves, we go to extremes. We're prepared to kill other people to protect ourselves. But in doing that, we haven't been able to save our true self. We've damaged ourselves. This is not perhaps a productive way to think about foreign affairs, least of all in the Middle East, where power is currency and weakness must be hidden at all costs. In this part of the world, statesmen survive because of what they smash, not because of what they say. And yet there was truth and humanity in this story, and so I kept it. She liked that this story didn't just paint Israelis as all bad and evil, but as bad and as good, as human, as flawed. And so she kept this story because it seemed true. It seemed to have that balance. Maybe I needed the story, and maybe I needed the story and need it still to organize my thinking. Maybe I clung to it because it helps when people are killing their neighbors, to believe they cry over it in the dark. Years later, I do not track down the woman who told me the story. I don't want to double check. Maybe I'm afraid she will take it away again. I have lived with it too long to give it back now. It has become mine. So the story she's clung to about humanity, she doesn't want to risk looking too closely at in case she finds out that it wasn't true. And that is how the stories of Jerusalem have worked for centuries. You cling to the stories that give you hope. And that story gave her hope. That the people who are doing bad things feel bad about what they're doing. I meditated on the story when I jogged along the clean rock walkways of Shirova Promenade, through the clumps of sweet lavender and sage, past the strolling settlers who gave me silent approbatory looks, and the skinny Arab boys who scrambled after me, bawling, "Jihad! Jihad! Jew! Jew!" The path scooped around the hillside over the ancient old city walls, and the church bells and the call to prayer quavered from below. The last rays of light glinted off the gold dome of the rock, and the sweet smell of herbs came up as the dirt grew cold at the roots. Palestinians trailed through the hills, prodding their goats. I ran through the olive trees and up ancient rocks beneath me, the wonder of the old city of Jerusalem, the physical beauty of Jerusalem, the transcendent power of a place packed with prayer and reverence is not a myth. And it is quite a beautiful city. It's amazing to be there, to hear the calls to prayer from the different religious groups, and just the physical beauty of the place is not a myth. It's actually pretty. I felt it every day I lived there. It was the consolation for the politics and oppression and misery, and that wonder never faded. Everyone wanted that city for themselves, but in the quiet hours of twilight they just walked and looked down at it. Arabs passing Jews, war suspended for no reason, but that it cannot always, every minute, exist. Everybody has a Sabbath in Jerusalem, and sometimes the war does too, although it doesn't come regular or announced. I thought about the story too, when I walked the glistening aisles of Israeli shopping malls and supermarkets, among bent Holocaust survivors and olive-clad soldiers and settlers, with small arsenals strapped to their backs. One of these anonymous men once sat in secret and wept with a Palestinian girl because she had been tortured. All Israelis had served in the army. What had they done, and who had they been, and what did they bring back home with them? So that's a common theme there. I'm going to pause now just because this video is getting so long, and I'll pick it up in our next lesson.